Chapter 1. The Lone Detective. The city lights glimmered like dim stars beneath the heavy fog that shrouded the narrow winding streets of Shadow Valley. There, where daylight scarcely penetrated, Eduardo Silva kept his office in a forgotten alley above a rundown bar where hopes went to die. Eduardo, a middle-aged man, spent endless hours in his office, surrounded by piles of files, extinguished cigarettes, and the omnipresent smell of stale coffee. His appearance reflected years of hard work and sleepless nights, graying hair, an unshaven beard, and eyes that bore the weight of untold secrets. He was a former police officer with a dark past that haunted him, marked by mistakes he preferred to forget, but which always returned with the same persistence as the fog that enveloped the valley. That night, rain drummed against the dirty window, creating a melancholic symphony that perfectly matched the detective's mood. He gazed through the glass, observing the city in an almost meditative state, when the phone rang, breaking the silence. At first, he ignored the sound, believing it to be another prank or a client looking for something trivial. But the insistent ringing made him rise, each step echoing on the wooden floor. When he answered, a desperate female voice filled the line. "Mr. Silva, please help me. My sister Clara is missing. They can't find her." Eduardo grabbed his notepad, his hoarse and weary voice responding with calculated calm. "Calm down, ma'am. Tell me exactly what happened." "She was at Misty Lake. Clara. She was so happy. But then she just vanished. The police found nothing. Please, she's all I have left." The name of the lake brought back a bitter memory. Misty Lake, a place shrouded in mysteries and legends, where the darkness seemed deeper and the secrets denser. Eduardo felt a chill run down his spine, but pushed aside any hesitation. "I'll find your sister, ma'am. I'll go to Misty Lake and uncover what happened. I promise." He noted down the details provided by the woman, Helena Duarte, and ended the call. Eduardo donned his old overcoat, feeling the familiar weight on his shoulders, and set out to face the night. On the way to the lake, the narrow streets of Shadow Valley embraced him in their icy grip. But Eduardo was determined. The lone detective had a mission, and nothing would stop him from fulfilling his promise. Chapter 2. The Desperate Call. The rain showed no signs of letting up as Eduardo Silva drove his car along the winding roads leading to Misty Lake. The headlights barely penetrated the dense darkness, reflecting the fog that seemed to take on a life of its own. Each raindrop hitting the windshield was a reminder of the case awaiting him, shrouded in mystery and despair. Upon arriving at the Duarte house, he was greeted by a woman with red eyes and a pale face. Helena Duarte, Clara's sister, looked on the verge of collapse. Her disheveled hair and wrinkled clothes showed she hadn't slept in days. Seeing him, she grabbed his hand tightly, as if he were her last hope. "Mr. Silva, please come in. We need to talk." Eduardo followed Helena to the living room, where family photos adorned the walls. Clara smiled in all of them, a vibrant young woman full of life. Helena pointed to one of the photos, her voice breaking with emotion. "That's Clara. She was so happy that day. We were celebrating her new job in the city, but now everything is falling apart." Eduardo looked at the photo, focusing on Clara's face. "Tell me everything from the beginning, Helena. Every detail matters." Helena took a deep breath and began to recount the story. Clara always loved Misty Lake. She said that place had something special, a melancholic beauty that drew her in. On the day she disappeared, she went there to relax, as she often did. But this time, she didn't come back. When night fell and she hadn't appeared, I started to worry. Helena's voice trembled as she continued. "I went to the lake with some friends to look for her. We found her car parked, but there was no sign of her. The police came, searched, but found nothing. They say it's possible she just got lost, but I feel there's something more. I feel she's in danger." Eduardo noted every word, every detail. And did Clara mention anything strange in the days before? Any arguments? Anyone bothering her? Helena thought for a moment. Actually, yes. Clara mentioned she was receiving anonymous messages, but thought it was just a bad joke. We never thought it could be something serious. Eduardo frowned, feeling a chill down his spine. Anonymous messages. That changes everything. I'll need to see those messages, if you still have them. Helena nodded, getting up to retrieve Clara's phone. While she was away, Eduardo looked around the room, feeling the weight of despair in the air. With each step he took, the mystery deepened, and he knew he couldn't fail. Helena returned with Clara's phone and handed it to Eduardo. Here they are. I hope this helps. Eduardo began reading the messages, his mind racing. The words on the screen were vague but threatening. You don't know who you're dealing with, and stay away from the lake were just some of the messages Clara had received. This is more serious than I thought, Eduardo said, closing the phone. Helena, I'm heading to the lake right now. I'll find out what happened to Clara. Helena grasped Eduardo's hand again, her eyes pleading for hope. Please, find my sister. Bring Clara back. Eduardo squeezed her hand back, firm and resolute. I'll do everything in my power. I promise. He left the Duarte house with renewed purpose, driving towards Misty Lake with determination. The mystery was just beginning to unravel, and Eduardo knew that every minute counted. Time was against him, but he was ready to face the darkness and bring Clara back. Chapter 3. The Lake Shrouded in Mystery. The fog around Misty Lake was so thick it seemed like a wall, impenetrable and sinister. Eduardo Silva parked his car and turned off the engine, letting the silence of the night envelop the surroundings. The lake was known for its melancholic beauty, but that night it looked like a nightmare scene. Eduardo walked slowly to the shore, each step echoing in the stillness. The dark water reflected the scant light that managed to penetrate the fog, creating a landscape of shadows and distorted forms. The trees around looked like somber giants, their branches stretching out like arms, ready to grab any intruder. Upon reaching the shore, Eduardo examined the area around him. There were no clear signs of a struggle, but the sense that something was wrong was palpable. He turned on a flashlight and began to explore, searching for any clues that might reveal Clara's whereabouts. As he scoured the shore, he found footprints partially erased by the mud and rain. He crouched to examine them more closely. The footprints were small, likely a woman's. Clara, he murmured to himself. The footprints led toward a little-used trail that went deeper into the forest surrounding the lake. Eduardo followed the footprints cautiously, his senses on high alert. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified. The rustling of leaves, the distant call of a night bird. Suddenly, he heard a distinct sound, a branch snapping that made his heart race. He stopped, holding his breath, trying to locate the source of the noise. From the mist emerged a hunched, elderly figure. It was a man with graying hair and a scruffy beard, his clothes simple and dirty. He looked at Eduardo with eyes that seemed to see beyond time, filled with untold stories. "Who are you?" Eduardo asked, keeping the flashlight trained on the stranger. "What are you doing here so late?" the man replied in a hoarse, weary voice. "This is no place to be at night, sir." "I'm Eduardo Silva, a private detective. I'm looking for a young woman named Clara. She disappeared around here recently. Have you seen her?" The man scratched his beard, his eyes fixed on Eduardo's. "Clara, yes, I saw her. A pretty girl, always smiling. But this place, the lake, has its secrets. She shouldn't have come here alone." Eduardo frowned. "What do you mean by that? What happened to her?" The old man sighed deeply. "I don't know for sure. I saw Clara talking to someone at the lake's edge. A man. It looked like an argument. After that, I didn't see her again. But I can tell you one thing, sir. The lake holds many secrets and not all of them are good." Before Eduardo could ask more questions, the man walked away, disappearing into the mist as silently as he had appeared. Eduardo stood there, his mind racing. Who was the man Clara met? And what secrets did the lake hold? Determined to find answers, Eduardo continued following the footprints until they vanished in an area of dense vegetation. There, something caught his eye, a small glimmer on the ground. He crouched down and, brushing aside the leaves, found a necklace with a heart-shaped pendant. It was Clara's. He held it firmly, feeling the weight of the situation increase. Eduardo knew he was getting closer to the truth, but also that he was entering dangerous territory. With Clara's necklace in hand, he vowed not to rest until he unraveled the mystery of Misty Lake. Chapter 4. The First Clue. As dawn approached, the fog around Misty Lake seemed to grow even denser, as if trying to hide its secrets from Eduardo Silva. The detective put Clara's necklace in his coat pocket and continued to explore the area, determined to follow any lead he found. Moving away from the shore, Eduardo discovered a trail that led to an old, worn-down cabin. The windows were broken, and the partially open door creaked in the wind. He approached cautiously, holding his flashlight like a weapon. In the silence of the night, any sound, no matter how small, could be crucial. Pushing the door open, it creaked loudly, echoing through the forest. The interior of the cabin was dark and damp, with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. In the corner, an old radio buzzed softly, blending with the sound of the rain outside. Eduardo searched every corner, looking for anything that might be related to Clara's disappearance. On a table he found a battered notebook. The pages were yellowed with age, but some recent notes caught his attention. They were records of meetings, descriptions of people and places. One name in particular stood out, Pedro Alencar. Eduardo recognized the name immediately. Pedro was the mayor's son, known for getting into trouble, but always protected by his father's power and influence. As Eduardo left the cabin, he heard hurried footsteps. He turned off his flashlight and hid behind a tree, watching as a figure stealthily approached the cabin. It was a tall, well-dressed young man, clearly out of place in this setting. Eduardo recognized him from newspaper photos. Pedro Alencar. Pedro entered the cabin and began searching frantically, overturning furniture and scattering papers. Eduardo took advantage of the moment to approach silently. When Pedro finally found the notebook, Eduardo turned on his flashlight, illuminating the young man's frightened face. "Looking for this?" Eduardo said firmly. Pedro jumped, dropping the notebook. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" "I'm Eduardo Silva, private detective. I'm investigating Clara's disappearance, and you, Pedro, seem quite involved in this story. Want to tell me what you know?" Pedro hesitated, but Eduardo's determined expression convinced him he had no choice. I don't know what happened to Clara. We were meeting secretly because my father wouldn't approve of our relationship. On the day she disappeared, we argued. She was upset, said she knew something big, something that could destroy my father." Eduardo narrowed his eyes. "And what was that? What did Clara know?" Pedro shook his head, desperate. "I don't know. She didn't tell me. She just said she needed time to think. I saw her heading toward the lake and then nothing. I looked for her but couldn't find her. I'm afraid something terrible has happened." Eduardo felt Pedro was telling the truth, but knew there were more layers of secrets to uncover. "You're going to help me find out what happened, Pedro, and together we'll find Clara. But if I find out you're hiding something, I won't hesitate to expose the whole truth, regardless of who your father is." Pedro nodded, his eyes filled with fear and determination. Eduardo knew they were about to unearth dangerous secrets, but he wouldn't back down. The mystery of Misty Lake was just beginning to reveal itself. Chapter 5. Community Secrets. Eduardo and Pedro left the cabin, the cold and damp night air enveloping them. They walked in silence to Eduardo's car, where Pedro got in hesitantly. The detective started the engine and drove towards the town, his mind working frantically to piece together the puzzle that was beginning to take shape. They arrived at the center of Shadow Valley, where the small community still harbored many secrets. Their first stop was Helena Duarte's house. Eduardo knew he needed to confront her with the new information. When they arrived, Helena was sitting in the living room, her eyes still red from crying. She quickly stood up when she saw Eduardo and Pedro enter. "Helena, we need to talk," Eduardo said, his voice firm but compassionate. "We've discovered that Clara was in a relationship with Pedro. Is that true?" Helena looked at Pedro with a mixture of surprise and pain. "Yes, it's true. Clara told me about Pedro but said she was trying to keep everything a secret because of his father. She was afraid something bad would happen." Eduardo nodded. "Clara mentioned something about a secret, something that could destroy Pedro's father. Do you know what she was talking about?" Helena hesitated, clearly struggling with her emotions. "She mentioned that she had found compromising documents in the mayor's office. Clara worked as an assistant at the town hall, and one day accidentally found proof of corruption. She wanted to do the right thing, but was scared." Pedro, hearing all this, looked paler than ever. "My father has always had enemies, but I never imagined he could be involved in something like this. We need to find out the truth and locate Clara before it's too late." Eduardo knew that the only way forward was to confront the mayor, but this would require caution and discretion. He decided that the next step was to investigate the mayor's office, a place that could hold all the answers. The following morning, Eduardo and Pedro headed to the town hall. The building was old, with stone walls and a facade that exuded authority and tradition. Eduardo knew the security would be tight, so he planned his approach meticulously. They entered as regular visitors, pretending to be interested in administrative matters. The detective managed to gain access to Clara's office, where he began searching for clues. Rummaging through drawers and files, he found documents that confirmed his suspicions: fraudulent contracts, embezzlement, all signed by Mayor Alencar. Clara was on the verge of exposing a corruption scheme that could topple the local elite. As Eduardo examined the documents, he heard footsteps approaching. He quickly hid behind a bookshelf. The door opened, and Mayor Alencar entered, talking to a tall, burly man who seemed to be his bodyguard. "We need to make sure this doesn't come to light," said the mayor, his voice filled with worry. "If Clara Duarte talks, we're finished. Take care of her." The bodyguard nodded and left the room, leaving the mayor alone. Eduardo knew he had to act quickly. With his heart pounding, he waited for the mayor to leave and then emerged from his hiding place, taking the incriminating documents with him. Back at Helena's house, Eduardo and Pedro examined the documents. Pedro was in disbelief. "My father, how could he do this? We need to take this to the police." Eduardo agreed. "But first, we need to find Clara. If the mayor knows she has these documents, her life is in danger." "Pedro, you need to help me convince your father to talk. We'll find out where Clara is hidden." Pedro, determined to do the right thing, nodded. "Let's go. I'll do whatever it takes to save Clara and expose the truth." Eduardo knew they were entering dangerous territory, but he was prepared to face anything to solve the mystery of Misty Lake and bring Clara back. The investigation was deepening, and the community's secrets were starting to unravel. Chapter 6. The Night Investigation. Night fell quickly over Shadow Valley, bringing with it a cloak of darkness that seemed impenetrable. Eduardo and Pedro prepared for a night investigation at Misty Lake. The plan was simple, but risky. Search for new clues in the area where Clara was last seen, hoping to find something the police had missed. They drove silently to the lake, where the fog was already beginning to form again. Eduardo turned off the car engine, and they both got out, armed with flashlights and a fierce determination. The air was cold, and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind created an atmosphere of suspense. "Let's split up," Eduardo suggested. You search the west shore, and I'll cover the east. If you find anything, alert me immediately." Pedro nodded, trying to hide his nervousness. "All right. Good luck, Eduardo." Eduardo proceeded along the east shore, his eyes sharp for any unusual details. The silence was broken only by the sound of cautious footsteps on the damp vegetation. The flashlight swept the ground, revealing bits of trash, fallen branches, and small animal tracks. Nothing seemed relevant until he spotted something shiny, partially buried in the mud. He bent down to examine it and found a small silver ring with engraved initials, CD. "Clara Duarte," he murmured, feeling a mix of relief and concern. He pocketed the ring and continued his search. Suddenly, he heard a muffled cry coming from Pedro's direction. Eduardo ran quickly along the trail, his heart racing. He reached the west shore and saw Pedro struggling with a tall, burly man, the same one Eduardo had seen in the mayor's office. The man had Pedro by the collar, trying to choke him. "Let him go!" Eduardo shouted, pointing the flashlight directly at the assailant's face. The man, momentarily blinded by the light, released Pedro, who fell to the ground, gasping for air. Eduardo advanced, ready to fight, but the man recovered quickly and drew a gun. Eduardo stopped, raising his hand slowly. "It didn't have to be this way, Detective," the man said, his voice as cold as steel. "You should have stayed out of this." "I can't do that," Eduardo replied firmly. "You're going to tell us where Clara is." The man laughed softly. "She's exactly where she should be. You'll never find her." Before Eduardo could react, the man fired at the ground, creating a cloud of dust and dirt that temporarily blinded him. When the dust settled, the assailant had vanished into the darkness. Eduardo helped Pedro up, both of them panting and covered in dirt. "Are you all right?" Eduardo asked, concerned. Pedro nodded, though he was still trembling. "Yes, I'm fine. He caught me by surprise. We need to find her, Eduardo. We can't give up now." Eduardo agreed, his eyes filled with determination. "We'll keep searching. Now we know Clara is nearby. They're keeping her hidden somewhere close." With their hearts pounding, the two men resumed their search, knowing time was against them. The darkness around them seemed more threatening than ever, but the hope of finding Clara gave them the strength to continue. Chapter 7. Dark Conspiracies. The darkness around Misty Lake seemed more oppressive as Eduardo and Pedro advanced, but the determination to find Clara lit their way. The night air was heavy with tense silence, broken only by the rustling leaves beneath their feet and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. They knew time was crucial. Eduardo, holding the flashlight firmly, focused on the narrow trail winding around the lake. Pedro walked beside him, his breathing still heavy from the earlier confrontation. "We should look for a place where they could hide someone," Eduardo said. "Somewhere remote, discreet." They walked for a few more minutes until they spotted an old cabin partially hidden by dense vegetation. Eduardo stopped and pointed with the flashlight. "There," he murmured, sensing they were close to something important. As they approached the cabin, they noticed the door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Eduardo signaled for Pedro to stay silent, and together they moved forward, each step careful and quiet. Eduardo pushed the door open slowly, revealing a dark and dusty interior. The smell of mold and abandonment filled the air. Eduardo's flashlight swept across the cabin's interior, revealing old furniture and a floor covered with dry leaves. Then, something metallic glinted in the darkness. Eduardo focused the light on the object and saw it was a small surveillance camera, discreetly positioned in a corner. "They're monitoring the area," Eduardo whispered. "We need to be quick." They continued exploring the cabin until they found a wooden door leading to a basement. Opening the door caused a loud creak, but Eduardo didn't hesitate. They carefully descended the stairs, which groaned under their weight until they reached a dimly lit space. At the far end of the basement, they found Clara, bound and gagged but alive. Her eyes were wide with fear, but upon seeing Eduardo and Pedro, a glimmer of hope appeared. Eduardo rushed to her and quickly untied her, while Pedro held her hand, trying to comfort her. "Clara, we're here. We're getting you out of here," Eduardo said, keeping his voice calm. Clara, her voice hoarse, managed to murmur, They're involved in something big. The mayor, he'll do anything to silence me." Pedro looked at Eduardo, his face full of determination. "We need to leave now. We can't let them catch us." Suddenly they heard heavy footsteps approaching. Eduardo knew they didn't have much time. "Let's go, quickly," he ordered, helping Clara up the stairs. As they exited the cabin, the fog seemed denser than ever, but Eduardo didn't let it deter him. He led Clara and Pedro along the trail to the car. When they arrived, Eduardo started the engine and sped away, feeling the tension slightly ease. But the battle was far from over. Eduardo knew exposing the mayor and his accomplices would be dangerous. Clara was now the key to unraveling the dark conspiracy enveloping Shadow Valley, and protecting her life was the top priority. "We'll take you to a safe place," Eduardo said to Clara as he drove. "Then you'll tell us everything you know. We'll make sure the truth comes out." Clara nodded, still trembling, but determined to do her part. "They won't get away with this. I'll tell everything." With those words, Eduardo felt a new wave of determination. The truth was close to being revealed, and he was ready to face any danger ahead. The night's darkness seemed less threatening now, illuminated by the promise of justice. Chapter 8. The Truth Behind the Fog. Night still enveloped Shadow Valley as Eduardo, Pedro, and Clara arrived at a safe house on the outskirts of town. The small country house, hidden among the trees, was a temporary refuge, a place where Clara could finally feel safe enough to reveal everything she knew. Inside the house, Eduardo prepared a hot drink for Clara, while Pedro tried to calm her. They sat at the kitchen table, where the soft lamplight contrasted with the darkness outside. Eduardo, with a notebook and pen ready, looked at Clara firmly but empathetically. "Clara, we need to know everything. From the beginning," he said, his voice gentle but urgent. Clara took a deep breath, sipping the hot drink before starting. "I was working as an assistant at the town hall when I found the documents. They were hidden in a locked drawer in the mayor's office. I was curious and I shouldn't have, but I opened it. What I found was shocking." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. Pedro held her hand, encouraging her to continue. There was evidence of corruption, embezzlement of public funds, fraudulent contracts, and the worst part, there were records of payments to influential people in town to keep everything quiet. Eduardo jotted everything down, his eyes shining with determination. "Who else was involved, Clara? We need names." Apart from the mayor, there were several local businessmen, police officers, even some state politicians. They formed a network of corruption that seemed untouchable. When I found these documents, I knew I was in danger. I told Pedro, but I didn't know he was already being followed. Pedro nodded, guilt evident on his face. "I didn't know my father was involved in something so dirty. When Clara told me, I tried to protect her, but they were faster." Clara continued, her voice steadier now. "They caught me and took me to that cabin. They said that if I tried to talk, no one would believe me, and that I would disappear, for real. I was kept there, waiting for the worst." Eduardo set the pen down and looked at Clara. "We're going to take these documents to the police and the press. We'll expose everything. But first, we need to ensure your safety. We can't risk them finding you again." Suddenly the sound of tires on gravel outside interrupted the conversation. Eduardo stood up quickly, peering out the window. A black car parked silently, and armed men got out, looking determined. "We have company," Eduardo said, his tone grim. "Pedro, take Clara to the back room and lock the door. Don't come out until I say it's safe." Pedro nodded and with Clara ran to the room, locking the door behind them. Eduardo, with a gun in hand, prepared to confront the intruders. Loud knocks on the door echoed through the house, followed by an authoritative voice. "We know you're in there. Hand over Clara, and no one gets hurt." Eduardo positioned himself next to the door, taking a deep breath. "You'll have to go through me first." The door was kicked in with a bang, and the men stormed into the house. Eduardo reacted quickly, using the furniture as cover, firing at the intruders. The fight was intense, but Eduardo's determination outmatched their numbers. One by one, the men fell until the last one fled, leaving the door open behind him. Breathless and with a few superficial cuts, Eduardo returned to the back room. Pedro unlocked the door, and Clara ran to embrace Eduardo, tears of relief streaming down her face. "It's all right now," Eduardo said, trying to calm his own racing heart. "We need to get out of here and take these documents to the police immediately. We're going to bring down this corruption network once and for all." With Clara safe and the evidence in hand, Eduardo knew the final showdown was near. The truth was about to be revealed, and nothing could stop justice from prevailing. Chapter 9. The Final Confrontation. The next morning arrived with a promise of revelation and justice. Eduardo, Clara, and Pedro headed to the city's central police station, a brick building that exuded an aura of authority. Clara was disguised with a hat and dark glasses, while Pedro stayed close by her side. Eduardo carried a folder filled with incriminating documents, the key to dismantling the corruption network. As they entered the station, they were greeted by Chief Mendez, a robust man with a serious demeanor. Eduardo had already informed him of their arrival, and Mendez was ready to listen. "Mr. Silva, Pedro, Clara, follow me," Mendez said, leading them to a back meeting room. Once seated, Eduardo placed the folder on the table and began to explain. "Chief, here is the evidence linking Mayor Alencar and several other influential members to a corruption network. Clara Duarte discovered these documents while working at the town hall and was kidnapped to be silenced. We need to act quickly to ensure everyone involved is held accountable." Mendez examined the documents, his expression growing darker. "These are very serious allegations, and this evidence is more than enough to launch an operation. But we need to ensure Clara's safety while we proceed with the arrests." Clara, still nervous, found the strength to speak. "I just want this to end. I'm willing to testify, but I need to know I'll be safe." Mendez nodded. "We'll arrange protection for you. Eduardo, you'll be crucial in coordinating this. Pedro, you'll help Clara prepare for the testimony." Before they could continue, an alarm sounded through the station. Mendez grabbed the phone quickly, listening to the voice on the other end. "What? How? All right, we'll handle it." He hung up and looked at the others, worried. "We have a problem. Someone tipped off the mayor and his cronies. They're coming here. We need to evacuate Clara immediately." Eduardo knew every second counted. "Pedro, get Clara to the car. I'll make sure we get out of here safely." As Pedro and Clara moved quickly to leave, Eduardo and Mendez organized a defensive line at the station's entrance. The black cars were already visible, men stepping out armed and determined. The gunfight began as soon as the mayor's men tried to enter. Eduardo, alongside Mendez and other officers, exchanged fire with the intruders. The battle was intense, but Eduardo remained steadfast, determined to protect Clara at all costs. Pedro and Clara managed to reach the car and drove off quickly, while Eduardo continued the fight. The sound of sirens bringing reinforcements finally brought relief. Law enforcement arrived, and together they overpowered the mayor's men, arresting them one by one. When the dust finally settled, Eduardo, wounded but not defeated, found Mendez. "Is Clara safe?" Mendez nodded. "Yes, she's on her way to a safe location. We've apprehended most of them. The mayor is still at large, but we'll find him. Thank you, Eduardo. Your work was crucial." Eduardo took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past few days finally lift a bit. The truth needed to be revealed. Now let's ensure all responsible are brought to justice. With the mission accomplished and Clara safe, Eduardo knew the battle was won. But the war against corruption continued. He was ready to face any challenge that came next, determined to bring justice to Shadow Valley. Chapter 10. Reflections in the Mist. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over Shadow Valley. Eduardo Silva, tired and wounded, walked slowly along the shore of Misty Lake. The case was closed, but the scars, both physical and emotional, were still deep. Mayor Alencar and his accomplices had been arrested. Clara was safe and under protection, ready to testify against the culprits. Yet, even with justice served, the weight of recent events still hung heavily over Eduardo. He stopped at the lake's edge, watching the mist rise gently from the water, as if it were a veil between the past and the present. He took a cigarette from his pocket and lit it, the smoke blending with the fog. Eduardo had always found comfort in the solitude of the lake, a place where he could reflect on his actions and choices. As he looked at the water, the events of the past few days played through his mind like a film. Clara, a brave young woman who risked everything to reveal the truth. Pedro, a young man caught between loyalty to his family and morality. And himself, a detective marked by the past, still fighting for justice. "You did the right thing," said a voice behind him. Eduardo turned to see Helena Duarte approaching. She seemed calmer now, with a look of gratitude and relief. "Helena," Eduardo greeted her with a nod. "I hope Clara is well." Helena smiled, though her eyes showed the strain of the past weeks. "She's safe, thanks to you, and she's determined to move forward, to rebuild her life." Eduardo nodded, feeling a mix of satisfaction and melancholy. It's been a long road, but the truth needed to come out. Helena stepped closer, looking out at the lake beside him. "Shadow Valley owes you a great deal, Eduardo. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." Eduardo took a drag of his cigarette, exhaling the smoke slowly. "No need to thank me. I was just doing my job. Justice is what matters." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the mist move gently over the water. Eduardo knew that despite having solved the case, the fight against corruption and injustice continued, and he was ready to face whatever came next, one step at a time. Helena broke the silence, her voice soft. "What will you do now?" Eduardo shrugged, looking out at the horizon. "Continue. There's always more to be done, more truths to uncover, more people to help." Helena smiled, admiring the detective's determination. "Shadow Valley is lucky to have you, Eduardo." He just smiled back, feeling a small flame of hope ignite within him. "Maybe, but I'd say I'm lucky to be able to make a difference." With those words, Eduardo took one last look at the lake before turning to walk back to the town. The mist was still there, but now it seemed less oppressive, more full of possibilities. He knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but he was ready to face them. After all, in the fight for truth and justice, every step, every action, counted. And as night fell over Shadow Valley, Eduardo Silva, the lone detective, disappeared into the mist, ready for his next mission.